My dad secretly called every architecture firm in town and told them I was a thief. For over 3 years, no one would hire me. He sneered, "You will end up coming back to serve the family." From a top architecture student, I was forced to wait tables. Last week, I finally got an interview. The CEO walked in, studied me for a long moment, then pulled out something that made the entire room go silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. My name is Kira. I am 33 years old, and I am currently wearing a stiff polyester uniform that smells faintly of cheap catered salmon. The ballroom of the Grand Chicago Hotel was a sea of glittering chandeliers, flowing silk gowns, and tailored tuxedos. I balanced a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes on my right hand, weaving through the elite crowd with practiced invisibility. The cheerful music from the string quartet floated above the dull roar of wealthy networking. 3 years ago, I would have been attending an event like this, wearing a designer dress, holding a glass instead of serving them. Back then, I was the rising star of the Chicago architectural scene. I had just won a prestigious National Design Award for my graduate thesis. I had a bright future, a mind full of innovative structural concepts, and a naive belief that hard work would always be rewarded. Now my reality was this heavy tray, the aching arches of my feet, and the constant fear of not making enough tips to pay my rent. The transition from a celebrated architectural designer to a banquet server had been brutal, sudden, and entirely orchestrated by the man who was supposed to protect me. I kept my head down, focusing entirely on the rim of the crystal flutes to ensure not a single drop spilled. My catering manager had made it very clear that any mistakes tonight would cost me my shifts for the rest of the month. I desperately needed this income to keep the lights on in my cramped studio apartment. As I turned the corner past a massive ice sculpture, a group of men in dark suits stepped backward directly into my path. I tried to pivot, but the polished marble floor offered no traction. A heavy shoulder slammed into my chest. The silver tray tipped violently. I desperately tried to catch the glasses, but 3 crystal flutes toppled over the edge, shattering against the marble floor. Cold champagne splashed across the expensive leather shoes of the man who had backed into me. I dropped to my knees immediately, my face burning with heat. I began gathering the broken shards of glass with my bare hands, whispering frantic apologies to the polished shoes standing before me. I grabbed a cloth from my apron and reached out to dab at the spilled champagne on his trousers. Before my hand could make contact, the man took a sharp step back. I looked up, ready to offer to pay for the dry cleaning out of my meager paycheck. The apology died in my throat. Standing above me, looking down with an expression of absolute disgust, was my father, Richard. He was flanked by 3 of the most powerful real estate investors in the Midwest, men I recognized from my childhood, men who used to come to our home for lavish dinners. Richard did not look surprised to see me. He looked triumphant. The air in our immediate circle seemed to freeze. The string quartet continued playing, but the conversations around us abruptly stopped. I remained on my knees, a piece of broken crystal digging painfully into my palm. I waited for him to show a fraction of paternal decency, perhaps a quiet word telling me to clean up and move along. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that I knew all too well. Richard raised his voice, ensuring that his wealthy colleagues and everyone within a 30-foot radius could hear him perfectly. "Careful with your wallets, gentlemen. My daughter has a habit of taking things that do not belong to her." He gestured toward me with his half-empty glass, his tone dripping with mock pity. "It is good to see you finally found a job suited to your moral compass, Kira." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate crowd. One of the investors, a man who had once bought me a graduation gift, shifted his gaze away from me, his face twisting with uncomfortable pity. Another man chuckled quietly, eager to align himself with Richard's cruel dominance. I was paralyzed. The humiliation washed over me in burning waves, sealing my throat closed. I wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to scream the truth to tell these men that I had never stolen a dime in my life. I wanted to tell them that the only thief in this room was the man wearing the $5,000 suit, the man who had stolen my designs, my career, and my reputation. But the words would not come. The sheer audacity of his cruelty left me completely mute. I remained frozen on the floor, the sticky champagne soaking through the knees of my uniform pants. My father stood tall, basking in the power dynamic he had so carefully orchestrated. He wanted me here on the ground at his feet. He wanted his peers to see what happens to anyone who defies him, even his own flesh and blood. This was not just a passing insult. It was a calculated execution of my dignity. Every pair of eyes felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my shoulders. The silence stretched on, suffocating and absolute. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the classical music. I slowly opened my hand, letting the sharp piece of broken crystal fall onto the tray. A small drop of my blood mixed with the spilled champagne. Richard did not even flinch at the sight of it. He simply adjusted his silk tie, turned his back to me, and resumed his conversation with the investors as if he had merely swatted away an insect. I stared at his broad back, the fabric of his suit jacket stretching slightly as he laughed at a joke one of his colleagues made. The sound of that laugh echoed in my head, a harsh reminder of how easily he could destroy my life, and then casually return to his own. My hands were shaking so violently that the remaining glasses on my tray rattled against each other. I took one final deep and steadying breath, trying to force oxygen into my lungs. The scent of the spilled champagne was overwhelming, sweet and sharp, mixing with the metallic tang of my own blood. I slowly gathered the last few shards of glass, my movements mechanical and stiff. No one offered to help. No one even looked at me anymore. I had been officially dismissed, reduced to an invisible servant in a room full of people who used to call me a prodigy. I pushed myself up from the marble floor. I was left totally alone now. A very dark shadow fell directly over me, blocking the warm light. My older brother's very expensive cedar cologne announced him long before he spoke. Cameron stood there, perfectly tailored in a midnight blue tuxedo, looking like the lead architect of our father's empire. He swirled his drink, his eyes scanning me from head to toe with practiced disdain. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, tossing the crumpled fabric directly onto my tray of broken glass. It landed in the puddle of spilled champagne, soaking up the pale liquid and a smear of my blood. "Do not forget to clock out, sis," Cameron said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "We would not want you padding your timesheet again." I gripped the edges of the silver tray until my knuckles turned white. I slowly stood, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Cameron was the golden boy, the untouchable heir. He possessed the title and the corner office. But he did not have the talent. We both knew it, and that was the silent war between us. I am not padding anything, I said, keeping my voice low and steady so the passing guests would not hear. I am working an honest job. Something you know absolutely nothing about. Cameron laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. An honest job pouring drinks for the people who actually design the city skyline. It is exactly where you belong after what you pulled. What I pulled, I repeated, my anger finally cracking my composure. You mean refusing to let you put your name on my graduate thesis? You mean refusing to let you submit my award-winning structural designs as your own work for the downtown project? Keep your voice down, Cameron hissed, glancing toward our father. You were a junior associate. The firm owned everything you produced. Dad made that very clear to you. I produced those designs in my dorm room on my own time, I fired back, my heart hammering against my ribs. And when I refused to sign them over so you could play the genius architect, Dad fired me. He did not just fire me, Cameron, he ruined me. Cameron stepped closer, invading my personal space. You ruined yourself, Kira. You stole $50,000 from the firm accounts. The audit proved it. There was no audit. I said, my voice trembling. Dad fabricated those embezzlement charges. He manufactured a paper trail because he knew I was going to take my designs to a rival firm. He framed me for a felony I never committed just to protect your fragile ego. He protected the family legacy, Cameron corrected smoothly. You were erratic. You were making false claims against your own brother. Dad just did what he had to do to protect the company. And honestly, considering he could have pressed criminal charges and put you in federal prison, you should be thanking him. Thanking him, I whispered, staring at my brother in disbelief. He personally called every single architecture firm in the Midwest. He told them I was a thief, a liability, and a fraud. He blacklisted me so thoroughly that I could not get a job anywhere. For 3 years, Cameron. 3 years I have been serving appetizers and clearing plates because my own father made sure no one in this industry would ever look at my resume. Cameron simply shrugged, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. Actions have consequences, Kira. You defied the family. You thought you were bigger than the firm. Dad just taught you a lesson in loyalty. You will end up coming back to serve the family eventually. Once you get tired of this little catering rebellion, maybe Dad will let you manage the filing room, assuming you can keep your hands out of the petty cash drawer. I stared at him, feeling a cold knot of resolve. I am never coming back, I said quietly. And I am never giving you another design to steal. Cameron smirked, stepping away. We do not need your designs, Kira. Dad is closing the Vanguard Holdings acquisition tomorrow. $600 million. Once that deal is signed, we will own the entire waterfront. Enjoy your shift. Try not to break any more glasses. The replacement cost might come out of your minimum wage. He turned and strolled back toward the center of the ballroom, sliding into a conversation. I watched him clink glasses, playing the role of the brilliant visionary architect. The sickening injustice of it burned in my throat. I forced myself to look away. I carried the heavy tray back to the service kitchens. My catering manager glared at me and pointed toward the dish station. I nodded silently, grabbed a wet rag, and spent the remaining 4 hours scraping caviar into the garbage. Every plate I cleared felt like another nail in the coffin of my career. By the time the gala finally ended, my body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion. I trudged up the 4 flights of stairs to my apartment building. I unlocked my door, stepping into the tiny space I called home. The radiator clanked weakly in the corner, barely pushing back the winter chill. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the edge of my unmade mattress. Reaching into my coat pocket, I pulled out my crumpled tip money. It was barely enough to cover my upcoming utility bill, let alone make a dent in my outstanding student loans. The financial trap my father had caught me in was absolute. He had deliberately cut off my oxygen, isolating me, starving me out, waiting for the day I would be desperate enough to crawl back to his corporate headquarters and beg for forgiveness. He wanted me broken. He wanted me to sign a confession for the fake embezzlement to completely clear Cameron's path. Across the small room, my laptop sat on a makeshift desk. My phone, charging next to the keyboard, buzzed with an incoming email notification. I dragged myself over to the desk. I opened my inbox, my eyes bleary and unfocused. The subject line, sitting at the top of the list, made my breath catch in my throat. It was not a rejection. It was an interview invitation. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen. The sender address ended with the corporate domain of Vanguard Holdings, the largest, most aggressive international development firm in the entire country. The same company my father had been courting for 2 years. The same company that was supposedly signing a $600 million acquisition deal for my father's waterfront property tomorrow morning. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I clicked on the email, reading the crisp, professional text. They were not offering me a junior drafting position. The email was a direct, urgent invitation for a final executive interview for the position of Senior Acquisition Director. The message stated that the CEO of Vanguard Holdings had personally requested my presence at their downtown headquarters at 9 o'clock the next morning. There was no request for references. There was no request for a background check. There was only a single commanding sentence at the very end of the email. We are fully aware of your very complicated history with your father's firm, and we strongly believe your very unique perspective is exactly what Vanguard requires immediately to execute our upcoming plans. The morning sun pierced the smudged window of my apartment as I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I wore a gray blazer and a skirt from a local thrift store. The fabric was stiff, the cut was out of style, and a faint smell of mothballs lingered. It was a far cry from the tailored designer suits I used to wear when I stood beside my father presenting multi-million-dollar architectural concepts. But it was all I had left to my name. I smoothed the lapels, took a deep breath, and stepped into the freezing Chicago wind. The Vanguard Holdings headquarters loomed over the downtown financial district like a fortress of glass and steel. Standing on the sidewalk before the massive revolving doors, the familiar weight of dread settled heavily into my stomach. My internal monologue screamed at me to turn around and go back to the catering kitchen. For 3 years, my father's blacklist had operated with flawless precision. Every single time I had managed to secure an interview, a mysterious phone call would suddenly cancel it. The Midwest real estate development world was a small club, and Richard controlled the guest list. I walked through the revolving doors and stepped into the cavernous lobby, feeling entirely out of place in my worn shoes. The floors were imported Italian marble, echoing softly beneath the confident shoes of busy executives. I approached the reception desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gave the receptionist my name, fully expecting her to glance at her screen, frown, and tell me there had been a terrible mistake. I braced myself for the polite but firm security escort out the front doors. Instead, she smiled warmly, printed a visitor badge, and directed me to a private elevator reserved exclusively for the executive floors. As the elevator shot upward, my paranoia shifted into overdrive. Why would Vanguard Holdings want me here? This was the exact company my father had been desperately trying to court. Today was the day Richard and Cameron were supposed to finalize the sale of their flagship waterfront property to Vanguard for $600 million. It made no sense for Vanguard to interview the disgraced blacklisted daughter of the man they were about to hand a fortune to. A sickening thought took root in my mind. What if this was a trap? What if my father had orchestrated this? Perhaps he asked Vanguard to bring me in just to officially reject me, cementing my absolute failure. Maybe Vanguard wanted to show my father they were loyal partners by humiliating the thief who had stolen from his firm. By the time the elevator doors slid open on the 50th floor, my palms were sweating and I was practically shaking with a mixture of profound terror and an involuntary sliver of hope. An executive assistant was waiting for me. She did not ask for my resume or a portfolio. She simply nodded and led me down a wide hallway lined with abstract art. We reached a set of massive double doors at the end of the corridor. The assistant pushed them open and gestured for me to step inside. I walked into the most intimidating boardroom I had ever seen. The room was expansive, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. In the center of the room sat a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by 24 high-backed leather chairs. The space was completely empty, completely devoid of the judgment and hostility I had been preparing myself to face. I stood near the door, too nervous to sit down. I looked out the window, tracing the outlines of the buildings I had once studied. The silence in the room was heavy, amplifying the sound of my own shallow breathing. I gripped the strap of my cheap bag tightly, waiting for the execution. I waited for a team of ruthless corporate recruiters to walk in and tear my history to shreds. The heavy wooden doors clicked open behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A single man walked into the room. He was in his late 50s, possessing a sharp, commanding presence, wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit that radiated quiet authority. I recognized him instantly from business magazines. This was Marcus Harrison, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. He was one of the most powerful real estate magnates in the world, a man who possessed the sheer corporate leverage to crush my father's firm into dust, if he ever truly wanted to. He closed the door firmly behind him, ensuring the lock clicked into place. My throat went completely dry. A CEO of his caliber did not personally conduct preliminary interviews, especially not for disgraced applicants wearing thrift store blazers. He walked slowly toward the head of the long mahogany table. I noticed his hands were empty. He was not carrying a corporate portfolio. He did not have a tablet. He did not hold a copy of my resume. Miss Kira, he said, his voice deep and resonant, echoing slightly in the vast space. Please take a seat. I moved rigidly to the nearest leather chair and sat down, keeping my back straight. He took the seat directly across from me, folding his hands on the polished wood. He studied me for a long, calculating moment. His gaze was piercing, analyzing every detail of my posture, my clothes, and the guarded expression on my face. You are wondering why you are here, Harrison stated softly. It was not a question. You are wondering if your father put me up to this. You are expecting me to bring up the embezzlement charges, the termination, and the subsequent blacklist that has kept you out of this industry for 3 long years. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know about the waterfront acquisition. I know my father is selling his property to you today. I do not understand what possible use I could be to Vanguard Holdings. Harrison did not smile. He reached into his suit jacket, withdrew an object, and placed it carefully onto the center of the mahogany table. He slid it slowly across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of me. I looked down, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. It was a weathered envelope made of thick yellowed parchment paper. The flap was sealed shut with a heavy dollop of dark crimson wax. My breath caught in my chest. Written across the aged paper in elegant looping fountain pen ink was my full name. I felt an icy shock radiate down my spine. I knew that handwriting. It belonged to my grandmother Beatrice. But that was impossible. She had passed away long before my father had destroyed my life. I looked up at Harrison, my mind spinning. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably. How do you have this? Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, watching my reaction with a calm, steady intensity. Before I took over Vanguard, I worked in private practice, he explained slowly. I was a specialized estate attorney. 13 years ago, your grandmother hired me to be her private legal counsel. She asked me to hold that exact envelope in a secure vault. She gave me very specific instructions regarding when it should be delivered to you. Harrison slid a letter opener under the flap of the parchment. The crimson wax cracked. I watched mesmerized as he pulled out documents alongside a letter on floral stationery. The faded purple hydrangeas sent a sharp ache through my chest. My grandmother used that exact stationery to write me every summer. She was the only person in our family who had ever truly seen me. She spent hours watching me sketch impossible buildings on napkins, telling me my mind was a rare gift. I always believed she died without knowing how my father would crush that gift. I was wrong. Harrison unfolded the letter. Beatrice was a remarkably perceptive woman, he began. She understood exactly who her son was. She knew Richard was a narcissist long before the business world figured it out. More importantly, she knew exactly how Richard operated within your family dynamic. She saw how he elevated your brother Cameron, treating him like the golden child. She told me over a decade ago that Richard would eventually cannibalize your raw talent to prop up your brother's lack of ability. I sat perfectly still, listening. Hearing a powerful CEO articulate the toxic dynamic of my childhood was jarring. It felt as though someone had finally turned on a light in a room I had been trapped inside my entire life. She actually said that, I whispered. She did. Harrison confirmed. Beatrice loved you. She recognized your brilliance when you were a teenager and knew your father would try to claim it as his own. She refused to let that happen. She wanted to build a fortress around your future. 13 years ago, we established an irrevocable blind trust in your name. You were designated as the exclusive beneficiary. Harrison set the letter aside and picked up a heavy legal document. Do you know the exact history of the downtown waterfront district, Kira? He asked, his voice returning to a crisp, professional cadence. The land your father built his flagship crown jewel development on. I nodded. My father bought that land from the city a decade ago. I answered, reciting the corporate history I had been fed my entire life. It was a massive revitalization project. It is the most valuable commercial real estate in the Midwest. It put our family firm on the map. Harrison shook his head. Richard never bought that land from the city. Beatrice bought it. She purchased the entire waterfront district quietly through shell companies before the city ever announced the revitalization project. And the very moment those deeds cleared, she placed the original ownership documents directly into your blind trust. The air in the boardroom seemed to thin. I stared at him, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was saying. "That cannot be right," I stammered. "My father built the crown jewel there. It is $1 billion complex. He has been collecting rent on those high-rises for years. He built it on land he does not own," Harrison corrected smoothly. "Richard holds a temporary revocable commercial lease. Beatrice structured it so your father could develop the property, but he would never possess the earth beneath it. She wanted him to build an empire, only to leave the keys to that empire entirely in your hands. That temporary lease had a specific termination date. It expired yesterday at midnight." My heart hammered against my ribs. The implications of his words were staggering and completely reality-altering. My father, the man who had cast me out into the street with absolutely nothing, had spent the last decade building his greatest achievement on dirt that legally belonged to me. "But that is not all Beatrice did to protect you," Harrison continued, picking up the next document. He turned it around and slid it across the table. I looked down. It was a photocopy of a drawing. It was an intricate architectural sketch of a sprawling commercial complex featuring cascading glass facades and a revolutionary internal support structure. I recognized the pencil strokes immediately. I had drawn this in my sketchbook when I was 16. I showed it to my father once, and he called it a nice fantasy. Harrison watched my eyes widen. "Beatrice found your sketchbooks," he explained. "She took them to an intellectual property attorney. 13 years ago, your grandmother legally copyrighted every single one of your teenage architectural sketches, including this exact structural layout." I traced the lines of the photocopy with a trembling finger. The cascading glass, the load-bearing pillars, the spatial flow. It was not a fantasy. It was the blueprint of the crown jewel. My father had not just stolen my graduate thesis 3 years ago. He had been stealing from me since I was a child. He took my teenage imagination and built $1 billion monument to himself. "The crown jewel was built using your stolen designs," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "It was built using your copyrighted intellectual property, and it sits squarely on your privately owned land. Your father is a trespasser, Kira. He is an intellectual property thief who has been profiting off your genius for over a decade." Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The betrayal was suffocating, yet beneath the crushing weight of my father's deception, a spark of vindication ignited in my chest. I was not a failure. I always possessed the talent my father claimed I lacked, and he was so deeply threatened by it that he had to steal it while I was a child. "Why wait until now?" I asked, my voice cracking as the emotion threatened to spill over. "Why not give this to me when he fired me? Why let me suffer for 3 years waiting tables and struggling to survive?" "Because Beatrice knew a weapon is only effective if you know how to wield it," Harrison said softly. "If you received this trust 3 years ago, you were still too eager for your father's approval. You would have confronted him, and he would have manipulated you into signing it away to him and Cameron. He would convince you it was for the good of the family. Beatrice needed you to see Richard for who he is. She needed you to experience his cruelty, survive his blacklist, and realize you do not need him. She needed you to become untouchable." Harrison paused, letting the truth of his words settle over me. I looked down at my thrift store suit, remembering the humiliation of kneeling on the marble floor the night before, wiping up champagne while my father mocked me. He tried to break me, but he forged me into something stronger. I was no longer begging for a seat at his table. Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The atmosphere in the room shifted, quiet reflection instantly replaced by razor-sharp corporate aggression. He looked at me, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards and was preparing to play a devastating hand. I stared at him in complete silence, my mind racing as the final pieces of my grandmother's incredible master plan slammed into their proper place right before my own eyes. Harrison smiles a predatory smile. Your father is trying to sell the crown jewel to Vanguard for $600 million tomorrow, but he doesn't own it. You do, and I need a new managing partner to execute the eviction. The silence in the boardroom stretched. The gravity of what Harrison was offering felt like a physical weight. I was being handed a loaded weapon and explicit permission to pull the trigger. I looked at the weathered envelope. Beatrice had seen this coming. She knew I would need Vanguard just as much as they needed me. I accept. I told him, my voice remarkably steady. But on one condition. My father cannot know I am the actual landowner. If Richard finds out I hold the deed before the ink is dry on his humiliation, he will freeze the trust in endless litigation. We need to blindside him completely. Harrison nodded slowly, his predatory smile widening. We will funnel the deed through a newly formed Vanguard holding company, he explained. On paper, Vanguard will appear as the sole entity challenging his lease. As of right now, you are officially appointed as Vanguard's Senior Acquisition Director. Tomorrow morning, you will sit in that chair and welcome your father to his worst nightmare. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with structural blueprints and legal clauses. When the sun finally rose, I did not put on my stiff thrift store suit. Instead, I wore a sharply tailored charcoal blazer and a crisp white silk shirt that Harrison's executive assistant had messaged me the funds to purchase. Walking through the revolving doors of Vanguard Holdings this morning was a completely different experience. I did not shrink away from the polished marble floors or the imposing glass walls. I walked with the measured stride of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. The receptionist handed me a sleek black security badge, granting me access to the executive suite. I rode the private elevator up to the 50th floor alone. I walked into the same massive boardroom where my life had changed just 24 hours ago. I took my place at the head of the mahogany table, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. I watched the heavy oak doors, waiting for the past to catch up with the present. Down in the lobby, Richard and Cameron were exactly on time. I watched them through the internal security feed on the tablet resting in front of me. My father strode through the entrance like a conquering king, wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit. Cameron flanked him, grinning arrogantly at the receptionist, acting as if he owned the building. They expected Harrison to shake their hands, praise Cameron's architectural vision, and hand over a check for $600 million. They had no idea they were walking straight into a meticulously planned ambush. The heavy oak doors to the boardroom clicked open. Harrison walked in first, his face a perfect mask of corporate neutrality. Richard followed closely behind him. Richard was saying how much he appreciated Vanguard recognizing the true value of the crown jewel. Cameron sauntered in right behind him, holding a thick leather briefcase that undoubtedly contained the fraudulent acquisition contracts they expected Vanguard to sign blindly. I never moved. I remained perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting my face in shadow for a brief moment. Richard marched toward the table, extending his hand toward the empty chair next to Harrison. Then his gaze shifted. He saw the figure sitting at the head of the table. My father stopped dead in his tracks. His extended hand dropped slowly to his side. The confident, booming smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. He blinked hard, as if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the bright morning light. He took a hesitant step closer, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished floor. Cameron, entirely oblivious to his father's sudden paralysis, stepped around him and tossed his heavy leather briefcase onto the table. Cameron looked up, ready to offer a slick greeting to the Vanguard executive team. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The arrogant smirk shattered into pieces. For a long, suffocating moment, the massive boardroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 50 stories below. What kind of sick joke is this? Cameron finally snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and rising panic. He whipped his head around to glare at Harrison, who simply stood by the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. What is she doing here? I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I am conducting an acquisition meeting, Cameron, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and flat. You are late. Please take a seat so we can review the terms of your surrender. Cameron's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He slammed his fist onto the table, making his own briefcase jump. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You do not belong in this building. You do not belong within 50 miles of this deal. He turned his furious gaze back to Harrison, his voice rising to an echoing shout. Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea who you let into your executive suite? She is a thief. She is a disgraced catering waitress who steals from her own family. Call your security team right now and have this waitress forcibly removed from the building before I call the police. Richard remained eerily quiet. He did not shout. He did not join Cameron's frantic demands for security. He simply stared at me, his sharp eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He was calculating the variables, trying to understand how the daughter he had crushed under his heel was suddenly sitting in the seat of power at the most important table of his life. He looked at my tailored charcoal blazer. He looked at the sleek black Vanguard security badge resting on the table next to my hands. He looked at Harrison, who was watching Cameron's meltdown with an expression of mild amusement. Harrison stepped forward, pulling out the chair next to my father. Vanguard Holdings does not take orders from junior architects, Cameron Harrison said smoothly. And we certainly do not remove our own executives from their own boardrooms. Miss Kira is our newly appointed Senior Acquisition Director. She has full undisputed authority over the crown jewel portfolio. You will address her with the respect her position demands, or you will be escorted out of this building by the very security team you are currently screaming for. Cameron choked on his own breath, taking a staggering step backward, as if Harrison had physically struck him. A senior acquisition director, he repeated weakly, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Impossible. She just pours drinks. She was serving us appetizers last night. I picked up the thick Vanguard acquisition file resting in front of me and dropped it heavily onto the center of the table. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the wood made Cameron flinch. Last night I was gathering intelligence, I told my brother, letting a cold smile touch my mouth. Today, I am deciding whether or not Vanguard Holdings is going to completely dismantle your fragile little empire. Sit down, Cameron. The meeting has already started. Cameron stared at me, his chest heaving under his expensive suit. He looked like a man who had just been told the sky was falling and expected someone else to fix it. He refused to sit down. Instead, he gripped the back of the leather chair so tightly, his knuckles turned a mottled white. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and wild, spouting a steady stream of venom. He called me a fraud, a bitter little girl playing dress-up, a catering waitress who had somehow conned her way into a boardroom where actual business was conducted. He insisted that I was having a psychotic break, that I had forged the security badge, that Harrison was the victim of an elaborate scam. I let him speak. I did not interrupt, nor did I raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the thick acquisition file, watching him unravel. The silence I offered in return was absolute ice cold and deeply unnerving. It was the kind of professional detachment I had watched my father use for decades to break lesser men. Now I was using it on his golden boy. Richard finally realized that Cameron was making a fool of himself. He reached out and grabbed his son by the arm, jerking him backward with surprising force. My father forced Cameron into the chair and then slowly took his own seat. Richard adjusted his jacket, smoothing his tie as if he could physically smooth over the catastrophic shift in the balance of power. He looked at Harrison, deliberately ignoring my presence. Marcus, my father began, using his most reasonable, soothing executive voice. I am not sure what kind of game is being played here today. If this is a negotiation tactic to rattle us before signing, I assure you it is unnecessary. Vanguard and my firm have a mutually beneficial relationship. We came here to finalize the sale of the crown jewel as agreed upon. $600 million. The paperwork is ready. We do not need to involve disgruntled former employees in a transaction of this magnitude. Harrison did not even blink. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing casually toward me with an open palm. As I stated, Richard Vanguard Holdings has placed this specific acquisition entirely in the hands of our senior director. You will direct your comments to her. I am simply here to observe. My father finally turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were cold, flat, and devoid of any paternal warmth. He was no longer looking at his daughter. He was looking at an obstacle. Fine, Richard snapped. You have had your little moment of revenge, Kira. You got to wear a nice suit and sit in a big chair. I hope it was worth whatever lies you had to tell to get into this building. Now slide the contracts over so we can sign them, and you can go back to whatever miserable life you have carved out for yourself. I opened the thick Vanguard folder resting in front of me. I took my time smoothing the crisp pages, letting the silence stretch out again. The satisfying sound of turning paper echoed in the vast room. I withdrew a thick stack of stapled documents and placed them squarely in the center of the mahogany table. I pushed the stack slowly toward my father. That is a revised acquisition contract, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. The previous offer of $600 million has been officially withdrawn by Vanguard Holdings. The new terms are outlined on page 1. Richard scoffed, shaking his head as if dealing with an unruly toddler. He picked up the contract, pulling a silver reading pen from his breast pocket. You do not have the authority to alter a finalized deal, Kira. This is a joke. I am going to call the Vanguard Board of Directors the minute I leave this room and have you thrown out on the street. He flipped to the first page. His eyes scanned the introductory paragraphs. Then his gaze stopped. The silver pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the polished wood table. He stared at the numbers printed in bold ink. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the paper, as if the digits might miraculously rearrange themselves into something else. This is a typographical error, Richard whispered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming confidence. It is not an error, I replied smoothly. Vanguard Holdings has conducted a thorough reassessment of the crown jewel property. Based on our internal valuations and newly uncovered liabilities regarding the structural integrity and intellectual property claims associated with the development, we are adjusting our purchase offer. Vanguard is now prepared to acquire the property for $240 million. Cameron choked on a harsh breath. $240 million. That is a 60% cut. You are out of your goddamn mind. That does not even cover the outstanding construction loans we took out to finish the plaza. It would bankrupt the firm. I kept my eyes locked on my father. That is the final and only offer Vanguard Holdings is extending for the physical assets on the property. His face began to change color, a deep, angry purple creeping up his neck and cheeks. You cannot do this, he growled, slamming his fist onto the contract. The market value of that complex is over $1 billion. $600 million was already a steep discount for a quick sale. $240 million is an insult. It is corporate robbery. I turned a page in my own file. You will also want to review Section 4, Subsection B. I continued, ignoring his outrage completely. It concerns the public relations and architectural accreditation of the Crown Jewel project post-acquisition. Cameron snatched the contract from in front of his father and frantically flipped through the pages. He found the section I mentioned and began reading aloud, his voice rising in panic with every word. Upon execution of this sale, the seller agrees to forfeit all claims of architectural design, structural conceptualization, and creative credit for the crown jewel property. Vanguard Holdings retains the exclusive right to publicly reassign all architectural accreditation to the original rightful creator. The seller specifically, Cameron, shall be legally barred from claiming the crown jewel as part of their professional portfolio in any future business endeavors. Cameron dropped the papers as if they had burned his hands. He looked at me, genuine terror replacing the arrogance in his eyes. You are stripping my name off the building. You are taking my credit. You never earned the credit, Cameron, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. You traced over my private blueprints. You stole a foundation you did not understand and slapped your name on a plaque in the lobby. Vanguard Holdings simply prefers historical accuracy in our acquisitions. The actual architect will be given full retroactive credit in all global industry publications. Richard stood up so violently his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the marble floor. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "We are pulling the deal entirely," Richard bellowed, his loud voice shaking the glass walls. He turned his wrath toward Harrison, pointing a trembling finger. "You made a fatal mistake today. You let a known thief dictate terms. You just cost Vanguard everything." Harrison did not even flinch at the outburst. He simply gestured toward the heavy oak doors. "Vanguard Holdings is quite comfortable with our position," Richard Harrison replied, his voice a smooth, unbreakable sheet of ice. "The offer of $240 million remains on the table for exactly 48 hours. After that, it drops by another 10%. We will expect your legal team to reach out when you are ready to proceed. If not, Vanguard will begin the eviction process by Friday morning." My father stared at Harrison, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. He had never been spoken to like this, never been backed into a corner where his money and reputation meant absolutely nothing. He turned his terrifying gaze toward me. His eyes were completely devoid of the man who had once taught me how to draft floor plans at the kitchen table. He saw only an enemy who needed to be crushed. "You think you have won because you found a loophole," Kira Richard said, his voice dropping to a vicious, gravelly whisper. "You think Vanguard can protect you from me. You have no idea what you have just unleashed." He spun on his heel and marched toward the exit. Cameron scrambled to grab his leather briefcase, nearly tripping over the legs of his own chair in his haste to follow. He shot me one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred before disappearing through the heavy oak doors. The click of the latch echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. I let out a long, shaky breath, sinking back into the leather chair. I left the Vanguard building that afternoon feeling a strange mixture of absolute triumph and creeping anxiety. For the first time in 3 years, I had a real job. I had an executive salary, a corporate backing, and the power to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But I also knew my father better than anyone. He was a man who operated in the shadows, pulling strings and cashing in favors to annihilate anyone who stood in his way. I took the train back to my tiny apartment, my mind racing with strategies for the upcoming legal battle over the crown jewel. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed my front door open immediately, noticing a bright yellow piece of paper taped aggressively to the inside of the doorframe. My stomach dropped. I tore the paper down and read the bold black print. It was a formal, legally binding 3-day notice to vacate the premises. The document cited a breach of lease regarding property damage that I had absolutely never committed. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. The property management company listed was a subsidiary I did not recognize, but a quick search on my phone confirmed my worst fears. The LLC was registered to Vanguard Holdings' biggest local competitor, a holding company that I knew for a fact was a silent partner to my father's firm. Richard had tracked down my address. He secretly owned the building I had been living in, or at least he held enough leverage over the owners to demand my immediate removal. He was flexing his dark influence to remind me that he could still ruin my life, that he could still put me out on the freezing Chicago streets within 72 hours. I crumpled the fraudulent eviction notice in my fist. He wanted me panicked. He wanted me desperate. But he was forgetting that I was no longer the broke, helpless waitress he had blacklisted. I had the Vanguard corporate legal team at my disposal now. I could fight the eviction, but I knew staying here would only invite more harassment. I grabbed a stack of cardboard boxes from the hallway closet and began tossing my meager belongings into them. As I folded my few decent sweaters into a box, I turned on my small television for background noise. I flipped the channel to a local business news network, my mind still preoccupied with finding a safe place to live by tomorrow morning. A familiar voice suddenly drifted from the television speakers, making me freeze in place. I looked up. Cameron was sitting in a sleek, brightly lit studio wearing a microphone headset. He was the featured guest on the city's most prominent real estate and business podcast, a show watched by every major developer, investor, and city official in the Midwest. The host, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, was leaning forward, looking completely captivated by whatever Cameron was saying. I dropped the sweater I was holding and stepped closer to the screen, turning up the volume. Cameron looked perfectly composed, projecting the image of a concerned ethical businessman. "It is a deeply unfortunate situation," Cameron was saying, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "Vanguard Holdings is a respected institution, but they have made a catastrophic error in their recent hiring practices. They recently appointed an executive to their acquisition team who has a documented history of severe instability." The host nodded gravely. "Are you saying this unnamed executive is actively trying to sabotage the crown jewel acquisition?" Cameron sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I am saying this individual is a vindictive, unstable former employee of our firm. She was terminated years ago for gross misconduct and theft. Now she is using her new position at Vanguard to pursue a personal vendetta. She is trying to ruin her own family out of pure jealousy because she simply lacked the talent to succeed in this industry. She is a liability, and Vanguard is risking their entire Midwest portfolio by letting her anywhere near a negotiation table." My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. Richard had wasted no time. He had sent Cameron on a public relations offensive to smear my character before Vanguard could officially announce the lease termination. They were trying to paint me as a bitter, jealous sister trying to steal her brother's glory, discrediting the truth before I even had the chance to speak it. I grabbed the thick roll of heavy packing tape, ripping off a very long strip with a loud, aggressive screech. I sealed the very first cardboard box, my eyes still burning holes directly into the television screen. The podcast host leaned back, looking highly sympathetic to my brother's completely fabricated plight. "We deeply appreciate you coming on the show to clear the air," Cameron, the host, said smoothly. "But let us move on to some positive news. I understand you have a major announcement regarding a brand new contract your firm just secured." Cameron smiled, his arrogant composure fully restored. "Yes, we are incredibly excited. My father and I have just finalized a massive deal with the city council. I will be the lead architect on a brand new $200 million civic center right in the heart of downtown." The screen cut to a highly polished, extremely high-definition digital rendering of the proposed building. It was a very massive, sweeping structure featuring a suspended glass atrium and a multi-tiered cantilevered roof. The rendering was beautiful enough to fool anyone who did not know how buildings actually survived Chicago winters. But I knew that shape. I knew that roofline. And the longer I stared at the glowing screen, the colder my hands became. I stared at the architectural blueprints scrolling across the screen, my blood running cold. I recognized the structural load distribution immediately. It was another one of my stolen designs, but I had abandoned that specific concept years ago because it possessed a fatal flaw. The cantilevered roof relied on a tensile weight balance that looked spectacular on paper but could not withstand the sheer wind forces typical of downtown Chicago winters. If Cameron built that civic center using those uncorrected schematics, the entire glass atrium would eventually collapse under its own weight. He was so eager to steal my work and claim the glory that he had not even bothered to run a basic environmental stress simulation. A wave of horror washed over me, followed by icy clarity. I could not stop Cameron tonight. That was a battle for tomorrow. Right now, I had a bright yellow eviction notice taped to my door, and a father who believed he still held the absolute power to render me completely homeless. I looked down at the cardboard box filled with my faded sweaters. A slow, dark smile crept across my face. Richard expected me to panic to beg him for a reprieve or to waste my time fighting his shell company in housing court. He wanted to drain my resources and distract me from Vanguard. I decided right then that I would not give him the satisfaction of a fight. I did not need this cramped apartment anymore. I reached into my purse and pulled out my new Vanguard smartphone. During my onboarding, Harrison had provided me with a direct line to the firm's relocation concierge. Along with my executive salary, my appointment had triggered a massive shift in my finances. My grandfather's trust, which Richard had kept locked away under the pretense that I was not established enough to inherit, was legally tied to my employment status. Vanguard's legal team had expedited the paperwork while I was in the boardroom. For the first time, I had liquid capital. I dialed the concierge. A polished voice answered on the second ring. I explained that I required an immediate relocation. I gave the agent specific parameters. I did not just want luxury, I wanted a specific location. I told her to look at the financial district, specifically the luxury residential high-rises located on West Walker Drive. I named the exact building I wanted, the Azure Tower. The Azure Tower was a soaring marvel of modern architecture, an exclusive glass monolith catering strictly to billionaires and corporate executives. More importantly, it was situated directly across the street from my father's corporate headquarters. In fact, it was significantly taller. The penthouses at the Azure cast a physical shadow over Richard's building every afternoon. The concierge did not hesitate. She informed me that a full-floor penthouse suite on the 75th floor had just become available. It was fully furnished, move-in ready, and priced at an astronomical monthly rate. I did not even blink. I authorized the lease using my unlocked trust funds and instructed Vanguard to handle the deposits. The concierge promised that a moving team would be at my apartment by 8 in the morning. I spent the night packing only what truly mattered. I left the broken furniture and the mismatched dishes. I packed my design journals, my drafting tools, and the few items of clothing that were not falling apart. I slept on the bare mattress, feeling lighter than I had in years. When the sun rose, I did not feel the usual dread. I felt the electric thrill of a woman stepping into her power. Exactly, at 8 o'clock, professional movers arrived. They wore immaculate uniforms and worked with silent efficiency. They boxed up my few remaining possessions and loaded them into a transport van. I handed my apartment keys to the building superintendent, who looked incredibly confused by my calm departure. He had clearly been instructed by Richard to expect a tearful, desperate scene. I simply wished him a good day and climbed into the back of the town car. The drive into the city felt entirely different this morning. The Chicago skyline was not a looming fortress keeping me locked out. It was my chessboard, and I was finally playing the game. The town car pulled into the private subterranean garage of the Azure Tower. A concierge greeted me by name, handing me an engraved metal keycard. He escorted me to a private express elevator that shot up 75 floors. When the doors glided open, I stepped directly into the foyer of my new penthouse. It was breathtaking. The space was massive, featuring wide plank oak floors, soaring ceilings, and imported Italian marble fixtures. The furnishings were sleek, modern, and incredibly expensive, all arranged in an open-concept living area. But the true masterpiece was the view. I walked across the living room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood, until I reached the floor-to-ceiling glass walls that wrapped around the southern exposure. The city stretched out beneath me like a glittering carpet. I stepped out onto the wraparound terrace, the brisk wind whipping my hair. I looked straight down. There it was. Directly below me, looking small and insignificant from this altitude, was the building that housed my father's architectural firm. I could see the rooftop of his private executive suite. I could see the private garage where he parked his custom sports car. I was standing on top of his world. Richard had tried to evict me, to throw me out onto the street and remind me that I was beneath him. Instead, I had elevated myself to a position where he would be forced to crane his neck just to look at my residence. Every time he walked out of his front doors, every time he looked out of his corner office window, he would be staring directly at the monolithic tower where his discarded daughter lived. He wanted to break my spirit. He had only succeeded in giving me a throne. I walked back inside, sliding the heavy glass terrace door shut. The profound silence of the penthouse wrapped around me. There were no noisy neighbors, no rattling pipes, no drafts creeping through poorly sealed windows. There was only the quiet hum of filtered air and the solid, undeniable reality of my new life. I walked over to the kitchen island, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. I opened my tablet to review my schedule. Cameron was still giving interviews, continuing his pathetic media tour to save face. My father was undoubtedly tearing his office apart, trying to figure out how to salvage the crown jewel deal without losing millions. They were both reacting, scrambling to control a narrative that had already slipped through their fingers. They thought they were fighting a desperate ex-employee. They did not realize they were fighting a woman who could now dismantle their legacy brick by brick. I walked to the dining table, spreading out my blueprints. I needed to document why Cameron's Civic Center design was a death trap. I needed to build a case so airtight that the city council would have no choice but to terminate his contract. Richard had struck the first blow with the eviction notice, thinking it a killing strike. But I was comfortable up here in the clouds. I was ready to rain fire. I spent the next several hours completely immersed in the structural flaws of Cameron and his Civic Center design. I spread my blueprints across the massive marble dining table, meticulously highlighting every failure in his proposal. The quiet isolation of the penthouse allowed my mind to work with an uninterrupted efficiency I had not felt in years. I was in the middle of calculating the exact wind shear velocity required to shatter his improperly anchored glass atrium when a sharp chime echoed through the silent apartment. It was the private elevator assigned exclusively to my floor. I frowned, setting my pencil down on the marble surface. The ground floor concierge had been given strict instructions not to allow anyone up to the 75th floor without my explicit verbal authorization. I walked slowly toward the foyer, my bare feet making no sound against the polished oak floors. I watched the digital floor indicator above the brushed steel doors tick upward with a quiet, mechanical precision. 73, 74, 75. The heavy metal doors slid open with a soft sigh. Standing in my private foyer was my mother, Patricia. She looked entirely out of place, yet completely in her element. She wore a pristine beige cashmere coat and carried a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. Her hair was styled in its usual waves, but her face was carefully arranged into a mask of maternal distress. I stared at her, genuinely shocked by her sudden appearance. I had not spoken a single word to my mother since the day Richard fired me, the day she stood silently in the corner of his office and watched him tear my entire life apart. Now she was standing in the foyer of my penthouse. I demanded to know how she had bypassed the lobby security. Patricia stepped out of the elevator, her high heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She ignored the question completely. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the staggering luxury of the open living room, the sweeping unobstructed views of the Chicago skyline, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the space. For a fleeting second, I saw raw, undisguised envy flash across her aristocratic features. Then just as quickly, the mask of the heartbroken, desperate peacemaker slid right back into place. Her lower lip trembled violently, and she pressed a hand to her chest, as if physically pained by the sight of me. She took a hesitant, trembling step forward, her eyes brimming with large, unshed tears. She pleaded with me to stop this absolute madness. She asked what had happened to her sweet, loving daughter, the girl who always put her family first. She told me that the entire family was falling apart, that my father was beside himself with grief and stress, and that Cameron was practically making himself sick with worry over my mental state. She begged me to please end this ridiculous corporate charade today before someone got permanently hurt. She insisted that Vanguard Holdings was simply using me as a pawn, that they would discard me the exact second this real estate deal closed, and that my real true place was back home with my family. She stepped closer, reaching out a manicured hand to gently touch my arm. She promised that if I just signed the revised acquisition contracts and formally apologized to my father, everything could go back to normal. We could be a happy family again. I stood my ground, refusing to let her close the physical distance between us. I did not recoil, but I did not accept her touch. I looked down at her outstretched hand, feeling a profound, heavy sense of disgust settle in my stomach. I asked her if Cameron was sick with worry before or after he went on a citywide business podcast to call me a vindictive, unstable thief. I asked her if my father was beside himself with grief when he secretly had a fraudulent eviction notice taped to my apartment door yesterday afternoon in a pathetic attempt to render me homeless. I told her I had absolutely no desire to go back to normal. Normal meant working 80 hours a week in the shadows so Cameron could steal the credit for my designs. Normal meant swallowing their constant daily belittlement while they paraded around the city pretending to be brilliant visionaries. I told her to leave my home immediately. I told her I had work to do today. Patricia slowly lowered her outstretched hand, the dramatic performance ending. The tears vanished, instantly evaporating as if they had never existed. She pulled her designer cashmere coat much tighter around her shoulders, and the weeping, desperate peacemaker completely disappeared. In her place stood the cold, calculating matriarch who helped build Richard and his empire. Patricia looked at me, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She told me I had always been an incredibly selfish child, constantly grasping desperately for expensive things that simply did not belong to me. She said I was too stubborn to see the bigger picture. I laughed a bitter sound. I asked if the bigger picture included framing me for embezzlement, so Richard had an excuse to fire me and seize my designs. I demanded to know how she could defend a man who claimed I stole $50,000 when we both knew I had never touched a dime. Patricia did not flinch. Instead, she let out a dry laugh. She told me that no one ever thought I actually stole the $50,000. She stated it as simple fact. I froze entirely in place. The breath caught painfully in my throat. I stared at her, and I asked exactly what she meant by that. Patricia explained that Cameron had gotten into an unfortunate situation 3 years ago. He had accumulated a massive underground gambling debt. The people he owed money to had violently threatened to physically break both of his hands. Richard needed $50,000 in untraceable cash immediately to pay them off and protect his golden boy. They had taken the cash from the firm to pay his gambling debts and used me as the convenient scapegoat to balance the ledgers. They publicly accused me of theft, completely destroyed my professional reputation, and permanently blacklisted me to cover up his reckless criminal mistakes. I asked how she could do that to her own daughter. Patricia's expression remained perfectly smooth, untroubled by any maternal guilt. She took a slow, calculated step toward the private elevator. She told me plainly that Cameron was the absolute, undeniable future of this family's long legacy. He had the necessary public presence to carry the firm into the next century. She told me I was talented but always meant to be behind the scenes. I was always just the stepping stone, the completely necessary sacrifice to ensure Cameron's ultimate shining success. She pressed the elevator button. The metal doors slid open. She turned back, her voice dropping to a dangerous threat. She gave me an explicit ultimatum. She demanded I sign the Vanguard deal by tomorrow morning, restoring Cameron's credit for the crown jewel. If I refused to comply, Richard would take the fabricated financial ledgers and press formal criminal charges against me for grand larceny. She promised they would definitely have me arrested, handcuffed, and thrown into a cold prison cell before the weekend. I looked at my mother as her ultimatum hung in the quiet air of my penthouse. A younger version of myself might have crumbled right then and there. I might have cried, begged for her to see reason, or frantically tried to defend my innocence against the threat of prison. But standing in this glass tower, looking at the woman who had willfully destroyed my life to cover up my brother and his gambling debts, I felt nothing but a deep, freezing calm. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply stared at her, my face completely impassive. My silence unnerved her more than any screaming match ever could. Patricia swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as she waited for me to break. When I offered her nothing but a blank, chilling stare, she took a slight step backward. She told me I had until 8 tomorrow morning sharp to make the right choice. Then she turned around and stepped into the elevator. I watched the steel doors slide shut, cutting off the view of her perfectly tailored coat. I stood alone in my foyer, letting the absolute magnitude of her confession sink into my bones. They had not just chosen Cameron over me. They actively, maliciously offered me up as a sacrificial lamb so he could keep his kneecaps intact and his reputation pristine. The grand larceny threat was an empty bluff. I knew for a fact that Vanguard Holdings possessed an entire army of corporate litigators who would chew through Richard and his fabricated ledgers before the police even finished filing a report. He could not touch my freedom, but I could absolutely touch his bottom line. I walked back to the kitchen island and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The sun was fully up now, casting brilliant rays of light across the hardwood floors. I sat down at my laptop, opening multiple secure financial tabs. It was time to stop reacting to my father and start dismantling his daily operations. Richard projected the image of a billionaire titan, but I knew the dirty secret of his firm. He operated almost entirely on leveraged credit. He tied his cash in high-yield investments, using commercial loans to fund the day-to-day physical operations of his architecture business. I tapped into the Vanguard corporate database and cross-referenced his firm with local commercial lenders. I was looking for something specific, something highly visible, and immediately painful to lose. It took me less than 45 minutes to find what I needed. Richard had recently renegotiated the commercial leases for his entire corporate vehicle fleet. This included the luxury town cars used to shuttle clients, the branded company vans used by his site managers, and the pair of custom imported sports cars driven exclusively by him and Cameron. He had bundled the fleet debt with the lease agreements for all of his high-end office equipment, including the massive industrial printers and drafting servers his entire staff relied on to function. The debt was held by a mid-level commercial lending group located just outside the city. They were a firm known for quietly selling off debt packages to larger institutions to free up their own liquidity. I picked up my phone and called my wealth manager at Vanguard. I instructed him to immediately form a blind holding company under my trust. I then authorized the transfer of enough liquid capital to purchase the bundle of Richard and his commercial debt at a premium markup. The lending group did not hesitate. Within 2 hours, the paperwork was digitally signed and the transfer complete. My father had absolutely no idea that his estranged daughter was now the sole owner of the debt on his cars and his computers. I set a highly specific financial trap deep within the covenants of the reassigned lease. If his firm's credit rating dropped by a single point, or if he missed a payment by even 1 hour, I had the legal right to call in the debt entirely or immediately repossess the physical assets without warning. I imagined the look on Cameron and his arrogant face when a tow truck arrived to drag his expensive car out of the parking garage. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The trap was set completely invisible and ready to snap shut the moment they slipped. With my father financially cornered, I turned my attention to the much larger problem hovering on the horizon. I opened a browser window and navigated directly to the Chicago City Council Public Records database. Cameron had proudly announced his $200 million Civic Center project on that podcast, which meant the preliminary designs had to be registered for public comment and environmental review. I typed his name into the search bar and hit enter. The database populated with dozens of highly detailed files. I clicked on the master architectural proposal and waited for the massive PDF to load. I connected my laptop to the large smart monitor mounted on my living room wall, projecting the images so I could see every minute detail. The digital renderings of the Civic Center filled my screen. It was exactly the same design Cameron had proudly shown on the podcast: a sweeping glass atrium, a dramatic cantilevered roof, and a structure that looked almost weightless from the outside. To anyone else, it was breathtaking. To me, it was a warning siren. I skipped past the glossy presentation images and opened the structural files. Within minutes, my stomach tightened. The support map, the tension lines, the shape of the roof, all of it was mine. Not my finished work, not even my best work. It was an abandoned college prototype I had buried years ago because the math was dangerous. Cameron had not stolen a masterpiece. He had stolen a mistake. He had taken a rejected design from my old files, dressed it up with expensive renderings, and sold it to the city as a $200 million civic landmark. He had not run the simulations. He had not checked the winter load. He had not understood the one thing that mattered most under Chicago wind and ice, that beautiful glass atrium could become a death trap. I opened the city council agenda and felt my pulse slam against my throat. The final approval vote was scheduled for Friday morning. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky. I woke up long before dawn, my mind racing through the sheer audacity of my brother's incompetence. I stood in front of the mirror in my master bedroom, carefully selecting my armor for the day. I chose a charcoal suit that projected absolute authority. I packed my leather briefcase with meticulous precision. Inside went the original encrypted hard drive from my college years, a stack of freshly printed structural stress analyses, and the wind shear velocity models that undeniably proved the impending disaster. I was going to dismantle their entire legacy on live television. The drive to Chicago City Hall felt different from my usual morning commute. The town car glided smoothly through the traffic. This city was famous for its relentless winters, the kind of brutal freezing wind that whipped off Lake Michigan and punished anything improperly anchored to the bedrock. Cameron was ignoring the very nature of the city he claimed to love, all for a glossy portfolio picture. The car pulled up to the imposing neoclassical columns of the municipal building. A throng of local news vans was already parked outside. I bypassed the main entrance crowd using my corporate credentials to slip through a side security checkpoint. The city council chambers were located on the second floor, a massive room paneled in dark walnut and trimmed with brass. Rows of heavy wooden benches sloped downward toward the central podium and the elevated desk where the 12 city council members sat. I slipped into the room just as the heavy doors were opening to the public. I chose a seat near the middle aisle, far enough back to remain inconspicuous, but perfectly positioned to have a clear view. I placed my briefcase on my lap and waited. The room filled rapidly. Local politicians, union representatives, and competing architectural firms crowded into the wooden pews. The ambient noise of overlapping conversations echoed off the high ceiling. A sudden ripple of hushed whispers swept through the room. I followed the collective gaze of the crowd and saw them entering through the front double doors. My father strode into the chamber like a conquering emperor. Richard wore a pristine navy suit, his posture impeccably straight, exuding the casual arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire city. Walking behind him was Cameron, looking sickeningly smug. Richard took his reserved seat in the front row right behind the presenter's podium. He leaned back looking relaxed and supremely confident. He smiled and nodded at a few passing council members, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch to absolute perfection. Cameron stood near the podium, chatting casually with the mayor's chief of staff, laughing at some private joke. He looked incredibly thirsty for validation. He had no idea that the foundation of his unearned glory was fundamentally broken. I watched my brother run a hand through his styled hair, soaking up the attention before speaking. The mayor struck his wooden gavel, calling the massive chamber to order. The room instantly quieted down, the low hum of conversation, replaced by the shuffling of papers and the whir of television cameras pivoting to focus on the center stage. The mayor spoke into his microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. He talked about the city's commitment to progress, the need for a modern civic center that would serve as a beacon of cultural innovation. He praised the local talent pool and then officially introduced my father's firm as the winning bid for the $200 million project. The chamber erupted into enthusiastic applause. Richard stood up from his front row seat, turning around to offer a modest, practiced bow to the crowd. He placed a heavy hand on Cameron's shoulder, giving him a squeeze before sitting back down. Cameron took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and stepped up to the wooden podium. He connected his tablet to the projection system, and the enormous digital screens mounted behind the council desk flared to life. The rendering of my stolen civic center filled the room. It was a breathtaking visual. The floating glass atrium caught the simulated sunlight, looking like a frozen wave suspended in midair over a massive public plaza. Cameron leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with smooth, rehearsed charisma. He thanked the mayor and the council for their visionary leadership. He thanked our father for his lifelong mentorship. And then, without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt, he began to take total credit for my work. He spoke passionately about the grueling late nights he supposedly spent agonizing over the conceptual sketches. He detailed the creative inspiration behind the cantilevered roof, claiming it represented the forward momentum of the city. He used all the right architectural buzzwords, weaving a compelling narrative about his dedicated artistic process. It was a spectacular performance entirely divorced from reality. I sat in the middle row, my face perfectly still, listening to my brother confidently explain a design he fundamentally did not understand. He pointed a laser pointer at the massive screen, tracing the delicate sweeping curves of the glass atrium. He bragged about the minimal use of structural steel, claiming his innovative tensile weight balance system allowed for maximum natural light without compromising the building's integrity. He called it a triumph of modern engineering. The council members nodded along, clearly captivated by the beautiful renderings and his confident delivery. The press corps snapped photos and typed furiously into their laptops, ready to declare him a hometown genius. The sheer incompetence of his presentation was almost physically painful to witness. Cameron was highlighting the exact structural flaws that would inevitably cause the building to collapse. He was actively boasting about the lack of heavy anchoring columns, presenting the dangerous vulnerability as a brilliant revolutionary feature. He did not mention the environmental stress simulations because he had obviously never run them. He simply saw a beautiful picture on my old hard drive and decided to claim it as his own, completely ignorant of the complex mathematics required to keep that glass wave from shattering under the pressure of a December blizzard. He was selling them a gorgeous illusion. Richard watched his son with an expression of profound, unadulterated pride. He looked like a man who had successfully secured his legacy for the next generation. He nodded approvingly as Cameron expertly handled a technical question from a city councilwoman regarding the sourcing of the glass panels. My father truly believed that he had won. He believed that he had successfully disposed of his problematic, rebellious daughter, covered up his son's humiliating gambling debts, and secured a massive historic civic contract that would cement their firm's dominance for decades. He sat in the front row, completely blind to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his head. Cameron wrapped up his presentation with a soaring, emotional conclusion about building a brighter future for Chicago. The chamber filled with loud, sustained applause. Several council members even stood up to clap. Cameron stepped out from behind the podium, waving to the crowd, his face flushed with triumph. He walked down the short steps and embraced our father. Richard patted him roughly on the back, pulling him into a tight, celebratory hug. The cameras flashed endlessly, capturing the touching moment between the legendary architect and his brilliant heir. The mayor leaned back into his microphone, asking if there were any final public comments before the official council vote commenced. That was the opening I had been waiting for. I unclasped my briefcase, standing up from my seat. The heavy brass clasps echoed during the transition between Cameron's applause and the mayor's call for public comment. I stepped into the center aisle, my dark suit blending with the professional attire of the politicians around me. I walked slowly down the sloping floor, my eyes fixed entirely on the wooden podium. The room buzzed with leftover excitement, but as I moved closer to the stage, the murmurs died down. People noticed the deliberate rhythm of my steps. Cameron was still standing near the edge of the stage. He did not see me until I was halfway down the aisle. When his eyes landed on my face, his confident smile froze, turning brittle. He nudged our father. Richard turned his head. The color drained instantly from my father's face, replaced by a flush of furious red. He recognized the leather briefcase. He knew exactly what I was capable of doing, and he realized with terrifying clarity that he had lost control of the narrative. The mayor cleared his throat, leaning into his microphone to ask me to state my name. Before I could speak, Richard was on his feet. He lunged toward the center aisle, physically blocking my path. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his voice booming through the chamber. He shouted to the mayor that I had no right to be here. He demanded the municipal police officers remove me immediately. He called me a disgruntled former employee, fired for corporate embezzlement. He told the council that I was a criminal, a thief under active investigation, and that my words were a vindictive lie meant to ruin a historic project. Two uniformed police officers started walking down the aisle toward me, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The chamber erupted into confused, shocked whispers. Flashbulbs from the local press corps went off in rapid succession. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to my father's frantic screaming. I looked directly up at the elevated desk where the city council sat. I spoke clearly and calmly, projecting my voice so it carried over my father's demands. I stated that this was a legally mandated public hearing designed specifically to collect citizen feedback on civic infrastructure. I reminded the mayor that as a tax-paying resident and a licensed architectural engineer, I had an absolute right to utilize my 3 minutes of public commentary. I added that if my father wished to formally accuse me of a felony, he was welcome to produce the official police reports. The mayor frowned, looking down at my father with deep irritation. He was a politician who valued order above all else, and Richard was making a massive scene on live television. The mayor struck his wooden gavel sharply against the sound block, ordering my father to sit down and reminding him that the public commentary period was open to all citizens. He waved the police officers away and gestured for me to take the podium. Richard stood frozen in the aisle, his chest heaving. He glared at me, his eyes promising absolute ruin, but he had no choice. He slowly backed away and sank into his front row seat. Cameron looked like he was going to be sick. He stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his hands gripping a table so tightly his knuckles were white. I stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the encrypted external hard drive. I unplugged Cameron's tablet from the projection system and connected my drive. I bypassed the encryption protocols and brought up my original files. The massive digital screens behind the council desk flickered for a brief second. Cameron's glossy renderings vanished. In their place, a dense web of raw structural mathematics and foundation schematics illuminated the room. In the top right corner of the screen, a digital timestamp clearly showed that these files had been created and registered 3 years ago, long before Cameron had ever proposed the project. A heavy, confusing silence fell over the chamber as the council members stared at the dense equations spanning the monitors. I introduced myself for the public record. I stated my name and my credentials as a former senior architectural designer for Vanguard Holdings. I addressed the mayor and the council directly. I told them that the $200 million Civic Center design they had just enthusiastically applauded was indeed a breathtaking piece of modern art. I told them it was visually stunning, highly ambitious, and completely unoriginal. I explained that the design on the screen was my own prototype, a concept I had drafted during my final year of university and subsequently discarded because it was structurally impossible to safely build. I picked up my laser pointer and aimed it at the central foundation calculations. I spoke with clinical precision, breaking down the complex engineering into terms everyone in the room could easily understand. I highlighted the sweeping cantilevered roof and the massive glass atrium that Cameron had just bragged about. I explained the fatal flaw in the tensile weight balance system. I showed them exactly how the minimal use of structural steel, which Cameron claimed was a revolutionary feature, was actually a catastrophic failure in basic load-bearing distribution. I walked them step by step through the environmental stress models. I projected the specific weather data for Chicago winters, detailing the exact combination of lateral wind shear and heavy precipitation. I pointed to the secondary support columns near the rear of the atrium. I demonstrated mathematically how the roof design acted as a massive funnel for winter storms. Instead of distributing the weight evenly down into the bedrock, the sweeping cantilever created a dangerous collection point. I explained that under a minimal winter snow load combined with standard seasonal wind pressure, the accumulation of wet snow and heavy ice would far exceed the tensile strength of the improperly anchored support cables. I ran the simulation program directly on the main screen. The entire chamber watched in horrified silence as the digital model of the Civic Center buckled under the simulated weight of a basic December snowstorm. The program demonstrated exactly how the glass atrium would shatter inward, pulling the entire cantilevered roof down in a catastrophic deadly collapse right into the main public concourse. I turned off the laser pointer and set it down on the wooden podium. I told the council that building this structure exactly as proposed would result in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. I explained that the man who presented the design did not run the environmental simulations because he did not create the blueprints. He stole them from an old hard drive and was too profoundly incompetent to understand the foundational mathematics required to keep the building standing. I stated that awarding a $200 million civic contract to a firm that prioritized stolen aesthetics over basic public safety was not just irresponsible, but criminally negligent. The silence in the city council chamber was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a massive explosion. Not a single person moved. I looked down at my family. Cameron had collapsed into a chair, crying quietly. He was exposed as a fraud. Richard was staring straight ahead. His posture had crumbled, the arrogant emperor replaced by sheer terror. I had completely dismantled their stolen legacy. The silence in the chamber stretched until the chief structural engineer for the city cleared his throat. He was a gray-haired man who had spent the last 30 years vetting municipal projects. He stood up from his seat at the far end of the council desk and adjusted his glasses. He asked me to transfer the raw data directly to his terminal. I tapped a few keys on my laptop, sending the encrypted file package to his secure network. The entire room waited in agonizing suspense as he opened the files. We could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard and the soft hum of the projection screen above us. He ran his own independent diagnostic software, feeding my equations into the city system. The progress bar on his monitor inched forward. When the results populated on his screen, the color drained from his face. He looked up at the mayor, his expression grim. He stated clearly into his microphone that my calculations were entirely accurate. He confirmed that the tensile weight balance was fundamentally flawed and that the glass atrium would fail under a standard Category 3 winter storm. A collective gasp echoed through the wooden pews. The mayor leaned forward, his face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and mounting anger. The mayor turned his attention directly to my brother. He demanded that Cameron step back up to the podium and explain himself. He asked how the lead architect could miss a basic load-bearing failure. Cameron slowly pushed himself out of his chair. He stepped up to the microphone, his hands visibly shaking. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The mayor asked him to explain the specific physics behind the cantilevered roof support. He asked Cameron to walk the council through the wind shear resistance models. Cameron opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stammered, looking frantically at our father for help. Richard remained frozen in his seat, refusing to meet his son's eyes. Cameron tried to string together a sentence using the same architectural buzzwords he had used earlier, but they sounded hollow and absurd now. He mumbled something about innovative design parameters and artistic vision. The chief engineer cut him off sharply. He asked Cameron to solve the basic algebraic equation for the roof tension on the whiteboard. He could not explain the physics because he did not possess the technical knowledge required to understand them. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, shifting from shock to outright hostility. The press cameras captured every single drop of sweat rolling down his face. He was drowning on live television. I did not give him a chance to catch his breath. I stepped back to the podium and stood right next to my brother. I told the council that Cameron could not explain the math because he did not write a single line of it. I navigated to the root directory of the files on the main screen. I pulled up the embedded digital metadata. I magnified the file properties so everyone in the enormous chamber could read the text clearly. I pointed to the original creation date. The digital timestamp showed that these exact blueprints were created 5 years ago. I pointed to the original author tag, which clearly displayed my full legal name and my university identification number. I explained that I had drafted this exact design for my senior thesis project. I told the room that I had abandoned the prototype because I realized my structural calculations were inherently dangerous. I stated that I had left those files on an old external hard drive in my childhood bedroom. I turned to look directly at Cameron. I told the council that my brother had broken into my personal property, stolen a discarded defective design, and presented it to the city of Chicago as a revolutionary masterpiece. The evidence was irrefutable. The digital footprints were permanently embedded in the code. There was no way to forge a 5-year-old server timestamp. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters shouted questions over the roar of the angry crowd. The mayor hammered his wooden gavel against the desk repeatedly, demanding order. When the massive room quieted, the mayor spoke with terrifying authority. He stated that the city of Chicago would not do business with a firm that engaged in intellectual property theft and prioritized vanity over public safety. He called for an immediate emergency motion. The 12 council members voted unanimously right then and there. The $200 million Civic Center contract was officially stripped from my father's firm. The loss of a municipal contract of that magnitude was a death sentence in the architectural world. The financial blow would be devastating, and the public relations nightmare instantly fatal. No city planner, no private developer, and no corporate investor would ever trust their firm again. Richard understood this instantly. Richard realized his empire was in a terrifying freefall. He stood up from his seat, his face contorted into a mask of desperate, frantic survival. He knew he needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to take the public fall so he could salvage whatever remained of his legacy. He turned his rage entirely on the son he had spent my entire life protecting. Richard marched over to the podium, shoving Cameron aside. He grabbed the microphone and screamed over the noise of the crowd. He announced to the press that he was absolutely appalled by this disgusting revelation. He claimed he had no idea that his son was capable of such a deceitful criminal act. He stated that his firm operated with the highest possible ethical standards and that he had been completely deceived by his own flesh and blood. Cameron stared at him, his jaw dropping in pure betrayal. He reached out to touch our father's arm, begging him to stop. Richard violently slapped his hand away. He looked his golden child directly in the eyes and fired him on live television. He told Cameron to clean out his desk and never set foot in the corporate headquarters again. The cameras caught every single second of the brutal public disowning. Patricia was going to have a complete breakdown when she watched the evening news. Richard turned back to the mayor, attempting to apologize and salvage the firm's reputation, but the council was already standing up to leave. They wanted nothing to do with him. I closed my laptop and placed the hard drive back into my leather briefcase. I walked up the center aisle, leaving my father and my brother to face the frenzy of the press corps. Richard was shouting, trying to control the narrative, desperately insisting that the firm was still financially sound and perfectly capable of handling massive commercial developments. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was clinging to his very last lifeline. He believed that even with the Civic Center contract gone, he still had the $600 million Vanguard Holdings acquisition of the Crown Jewel property. He thought that massive payout would provide the necessary capital to weather this storm, pay off his creditors, and rebuild his shattered reputation. He truly believed he was still holding the winning hand in a high-stakes game. He had absolutely no idea that I was the new senior director of acquisitions for Vanguard Holdings, or that the Crown Jewel deal he was banking his entire future on was sitting on my desk waiting for my final approval. Exactly 1 week passed since the city council hearing. The fallout had been swift and merciless. My father's firm was hemorrhaging clients by the hour, their reputation burned to ash on live television. Yet Richard refused to accept defeat. Instead of retreating into the shadows to assess his massive losses, he doubled down on his delusions of grandeur. He poured his rapidly dwindling credit into hosting a lavish gala at the Crown Jewel waterfront development. It was his masterpiece commercial property, a sprawling complex of luxury high-rises and retail pavilions situated right on the edge of Lake Michigan. The event was entirely a glittering facade. He intended to corner Marcus Harrison, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, and force the signature on the $600 million acquisition papers. Richard fully believed that Vanguard could not afford to lose such a prime piece of real estate, and he was betting his entire sinking empire on that single assumption. The night of the gala was unseasonably cold. the biting wind off the lake whipping against the massive glass walls of the Crown Jewel Grand Ballroom. I sat in the back of a sleek black town car, watching the brilliant lights of the event illuminate the dark churning water. Beside me sat Marcus Harrison. Marcus was a man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. He wore a tailored black tuxedo and an expression of mild distaste as he looked out at the extravagant valet line forming near the entrance. He despised flashy displays of wealth, preferring the quiet, ruthless efficiency of corporate boardrooms. He had trusted my judgment when I first joined Vanguard, and my recent promotion to Senior Director of Acquisitions had only solidified that unbreakable bond. We had spent the entire week reviewing the Crown Jewel portfolio, dissecting my father's heavily leveraged debt and the toxic covenants hidden deep within his commercial leases. Marcus knew exactly what we were walking into tonight. He turned to me, adjusting his silver cufflinks, and asked if I was completely ready to close this deal. I smiled, feeling a deep, freezing calm settle over my nerves, and told him I had been ready for years. The chauffeur opened my door, and the freezing wind instantly hit my face. I stepped out onto the plush red carpet, wearing a floor-length emerald gown that offered no defense against the winter chill, but projected exactly the kind of quiet, absolute power I needed for this night. Marcus offered me his arm, and we walked up the wide marble steps together in perfect synchronization. The entrance was flanked by towering ice sculptures and massive floral arrangements of white orchids that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. It was a pathetic, transparent display of a man pretending he was not drowning in corporate debt. We handed our heavy coats to a waiting attendant and stepped through the heavy brass doors into the main ballroom. The sheer scale of my father's desperation was staggering to witness. He had rented out the entire ground floor of the commercial pavilion. A 12-piece string orchestra played softly in the corner, while waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. Hundreds of local elites, politicians, and business leaders milled around the massive room, their hushed whispers creating a low, vibrating hum of tension. They were all here to see if the great Richard Wilson would survive the week. We moved slowly and deliberately through the crowded room. I could feel the immediate palpable shift in the atmosphere as people began to recognize me. The whispers grew louder, spreading like a sudden wildfire through the elegant ballroom. Guests actively stepped out of our way, their eyes darting nervously between me and the Vanguard chief executive officer. They had all seen the local news broadcasts. They had all watched me tear down my brother and expose my father's architectural firm as a hollow, incompetent shell. Seeing me walk into his highly exclusive gala on the arm of his potential savior sent a massive shockwave of confusion through the room. I kept my head high, my face an absolute mask of professional indifference. I did not search the room for my father. I knew he would find me soon enough. It took less than 3 minutes. The crowd parted near the center of the ballroom, and Richard emerged. His pristine tuxedo could not hide the frantic, chaotic energy radiating from his every movement. His face was flushed red, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead beneath the heavy crystal chandelier lights. He locked eyes with me, and I saw a flash of pure, unrestrained panic cross his aging features before he forced a wide, artificial smile onto his face. Richard practically sprinted toward us, completely abandoning the slow, measured stride he usually employed to project absolute authority. He aggressively pushed past a local city alderman, his eyes fixed entirely on Marcus Harrison. He did not even look at me at first. He reached out with both hands, grasping Marcus by the arm in a grip that bordered on pathetic and desperate. He loudly welcomed Marcus to the Crown Jewel, his voice booming awkwardly over the soft music of the string orchestra. He started immediately rambling about the magnificent turnout, the unparalleled value of the waterfront property, and how thrilled he was that Vanguard Holdings was ready to finalize their historic lucrative partnership. He was speaking entirely too fast, his words stumbling over each other in his frantic rush to control the crumbling narrative. Marcus stood perfectly still, allowing Richard to grasp his arm, his expression remaining completely unreadable. He did not return the enthusiastic, desperate greeting. He simply looked down at my father with the cold, calculating stare of an apex predator assessing a severely wounded animal. The deafening silence from the Vanguard executive seemed to unnerve Richard even more. His forced, blinding smile began to tremble at the edges. It was only then that he finally turned his panicked attention to me, standing silently and confidently by Marcus's side. The moment Richard actually looked at me, the artificial warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a mask of raw, unfiltered hatred. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He stepped forward aggressively, attempting to physically block my path using his broad shoulders to completely cut me off from Marcus. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous hiss that only the three of us could hear over the ambient noise of the crowded gala. He told me that I had absolutely no right to be here tonight. He told me that I was a total disgrace, a bitter, jealous child who had already done enough damage to this family and this company. He ordered me to turn around, walk out those brass doors, and never show my face in his city again. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, my emerald gown brushing lightly against the polished marble floor, and met his furious, unhinged gaze with absolute chilling silence. My total lack of reaction only fueled his rising panic. He abruptly turned his back on me, physically dismissing my presence, and focused his desperate, sweating face entirely back on Marcus. He pleaded with the silent executive, his voice tight and visibly shaking with underlying terror. "Sign the papers, Harrison. Ignore my deranged daughter." Marcus Harrison looked down at the expensive gold fountain pen my father was practically shoving into his chest. He did not blink. He did not step back. He simply let out a low, humorless chuckle that cut through my father's frantic breathing like a freshly sharpened blade. Marcus slowly reached up, but he did not take the pen. Instead, he gently pushed my father's trembling hand away, lowering the gold instrument back to Richard's side. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. My father stared at him, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Marcus looked around the lavish ballroom, taking in the glittering chandeliers, the exorbitant floral arrangements, and the crowd of nervous investors who were failing to pretend they were not watching this exact exchange. He turned his cold gaze back to my father and spoke in a voice that carried perfectly across the sudden silence of the room. He explained that Vanguard Holdings did not operate through backroom intimidation tactics, nor did they finalize nine-figure real estate acquisitions based on the desperate demands of a man actively hemorrhaging his commercial credibility. My father tried to interrupt, stammering something about a guaranteed return on investment, but Marcus simply raised a single finger, demanding absolute silence. He then took a deliberate step backward, creating a clear physical space between himself and my father. He gestured gracefully toward me. Marcus announced to my father, and to the dozen wealthy spectators hovering nearby, that he was merely the chief executive officer. He stated that every single real estate acquisition, especially one carrying the toxic debt load of the crown jewel property, fell under the exclusive, unquestionable jurisdiction of his senior director of acquisitions. He smiled a sharp, terrifying smile and deferred the entire decision to me. Richard turned his head so fast I thought his neck might snap. He stared at me, his eyes wide and completely uncomprehending. His brain simply refused to process the words Marcus had just spoken. The idea that his discarded, rebellious daughter held the absolute key to his financial salvation was fundamentally incompatible with his entire worldview. He looked at me in my emerald gown, his gaze darting to the leather portfolio I carried tucked under my arm. He took a stumbling step forward, his voice dropping from an aggressive shout to a hoarse, pleading whisper. He told me this was not a game. He told me that thousands of jobs and the entire legacy of our family depended on this specific signature. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life trying to erase my potential, the man who had just days ago tried to have me arrested for telling the truth about a building that would have killed innocent people. I felt no pity. I felt no hesitation. I simply opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a faded, heavy parchment envelope. The wax seal on the back had been broken, but the elegant, spidery handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was my grandmother Beatrice's handwriting. The envelope was exactly 13 years old, preserved perfectly in a climate-controlled bank vault until I was ready to bring it into the light. Richard stared at the faded parchment, his eyes widening in pure horror. He recognized the stationery. He knew his mother's handwriting. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He reached a shaking hand out toward the envelope, his fingers trembling wildly. I stepped back, keeping the envelope safely out of his desperate reach. I signaled to the audiovisual technician standing near the edge of the grand stage. Marcus had arranged for Vanguard security to secure the control booth the moment we walked through the brass doors. The technician nodded, hitting a switch on his master console. The soft classical music from the string orchestra abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp hum of the massive digital presentation screens descending from the ceiling. These were the screens my father intended to use to showcase the glossy fictional profitability of the crown jewel to his investors. Instead, they were about to broadcast his complete ruin. The room fell into absolute deafening silence. Every politician, every wealthy socialite, and every member of the local press corps turned their attention to the towering monitors. I walked past my father, moving deliberately toward the center of the ballroom floor. I held the microphone that an attendant discreetly handed to me. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the men and women who had blindly funded my father's empire for decades. I spoke clearly into the microphone, my voice echoing off the high glass walls. I welcomed them to the crown jewel. I thanked them for gathering to celebrate the pinnacle of Wilson corporate development. And then I told them that the man hosting this lavish party did not actually own a single brick of the building we were standing inside. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Richard let out a strangled, animalistic cry, lunging forward to grab the microphone, but two massive Vanguard security guards stepped smoothly into his path, crossing their arms and blocking him entirely. He shouted that I was lying, that I was a hysterical, vindictive child trying to ruin him out of pure spite. I ignored his frantic screaming. I pulled the documents from Grandmother Beatrice's envelope. I handed the first stack of heavy notarized papers to the technician. Seconds later, the high-definition images populated on the massive screens suspended above us. I pointed to the glowing displays. I explained to the crowd of investors that my grandmother had possessed an incredibly sharp, uncompromising mind for business. I told them she knew exactly what kind of reckless, ego-driven man her son truly was. I directed their attention to the first document, an irrevocable trust deed drafted and finalized 13 years ago. The legal language was stark and completely undeniable. The trust explicitly transferred the primary ownership stakes of the original Wilson family land holdings, not to Richard, but directly to me, completely bypassing his generation. The land beneath the crown jewel, the very foundation of this entire waterfront development, belonged exclusively to the Beatrice Wilson Legacy Trust. I was the sole named beneficiary, and I had officially assumed total executive control of that trust on my 25th birthday. My father had built his $600 million masterpiece on ground he legally leased from me. He had hidden this fact from his investors through a complex web of shell companies, but the original unalterable trust deeds were now glowing brightly for the entire city to read. I handed the second stack of documents to the technician. The massive screens shifted, displaying detailed intellectual property filings and registered copyright patents. I explained that my father funded his career selling a proprietary architectural software framework. He claimed he designed it himself. The patents proved otherwise. They were registered to my grandmother, and she transferred those exclusive copyrights into my trust. He had spent the last decade committing corporate fraud, licensing software he did not own to build developments on land he did not control. I lowered the microphone, watching my father collapse onto his knees on the marble floor. He stared at the screens in silent devastation. His investors were pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their legal teams. The press cameras captured his total ruin. Richard Wilson had absolutely nothing left to sell. I looked down at the man who had terrorized our family for decades. For the first time in my life, Richard Wilson looked small, not powerful, not untouchable, just small. I turned back to the investors, the politicians, and the cameras. The documents on the screens had already said more than any accusation ever could. The land beneath their feet belonged to my trust. The design that made this building famous had come from my hands. Richard had not built an empire. He had built a monument to his own fraud. The room understood it all at once. Phones came out, lawyers were called, investors stepped away from him as if his disgrace were contagious. Every face that had once admired him now calculated how much money he had cost them. Richard tried to speak, but no one was listening anymore. I signaled to one of the Vanguard security personnel standing near the wooden stage. He stepped forward and handed me a thick, heavy manila folder packed with legal documents. I walked slowly over to my father. He was still resting on his knees, his breathing ragged and terrifyingly uneven. His eyes were wide with a pure terror that I had never seen before in my entire life. I dropped the heavy folder directly onto the polished marble floor right in front of him. The sharp sound echoed loudly over the tense silence of the angry crowd. I told him that he was officially served. I calmly explained that the thick folder contained a comprehensive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit. I was suing him personally and professionally for 13 years of unpaid back rent on the crown jewel property, along with massive punitive damages for the blatant theft of my intellectual property. The financial numbers were staggering, far exceeding any liquid capital his failing firm could possibly scrape together. But that was not the end of the swift legal action. I pulled one final document from my leather portfolio. It was printed on heavy, bright white paper. I held it up high so the furious investors and the rabid press could see it clearly before I dropped it right on top of the manila folder. I announced to the ballroom that it was a formal, immediate eviction notice. He was being legally evicted from his own flagship building effective tonight. Richard stared at the eviction notice as if it were a highly venomous snake. His hands shook violently as he reached out to touch the paper, quickly pulling them back before making contact. Slowly, he pushed himself off the marble floor, his joints popping and trembling under his own weight. He swayed slightly on his feet, looking around frantically at the deeply hostile faces of the wealthy investors who had once blindly worshipped him. He saw absolutely no sympathy in their eyes, only furious calculations of their own devastating financial losses. He turned back to me, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of raw rage and pure desperation. He shouted that I could not possibly do this to him. He screamed that I was brutally destroying my own flesh and blood, that I was tearing our entire family apart for the sake of a petty, vindictive grudge. He practically pleaded with the room, loudly claiming that family loyalty should mean something important, that a daughter should not be legally allowed to ruin her dedicated father on a technicality. I looked at him, feeling absolutely no remorse in my freezing heart. The long years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling of my architectural talent, the endless financial manipulation, and the cruel abandonment all completely dissolved into this single crystal-clear moment of retribution. I let his desperate shouting echo through the cavernous ballroom until he finally ran out of breath and began to heavily pant. I stared directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I kept my voice perfectly even, completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. I told him that failures do not belong here, Richard. Pack your bags. The brutal familiarity of his own cruel words seemed to strike him with overwhelming physical force. He stumbled backward, violently bumping into a tall cocktail table and sending several expensive crystal glasses shattering to the marble floor. Marcus Harrison stepped smoothly to my side, seamlessly taking control of the shifting narrative. He addressed the angry crowd, his deep voice projecting the quiet, absolute authority that made him an undeniable titan in the corporate world. He announced that Vanguard Holdings was indeed moving forward with the $600 million acquisition of the crown jewel property. However, he quickly clarified that the massive transaction had absolutely nothing to do with Richard Wilson or his entirely disgraced firm. The Vanguard acquisition was a direct private transaction with the legal owner of the land and the sole copyright holder of the architectural design. He placed a hand respectfully on my shoulder and firmly confirmed to the waiting press that the entire $600 million payout would be routed directly into my personal trust account. The historic deal was already finalized, the funds securely transferred before the gala even began. Richard let out a hollow, defeated gasp. The brutal reality of his grim situation was absolute. He had lost the waterfront property, he had lost his loyal investors, and he had completely lost the massive Vanguard payout he so desperately needed to save himself from total bankruptcy. He was left with absolutely nothing but an insurmountable mountain of legal debt and a professional reputation burned to ashes. As if perfectly on cue, the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open. A tactical team of federal marshals, flanked by local police officers, marched into the elegant venue. They carried official court orders authorizing the immediate seizure of Richard's corporate assets to cover his outstanding creditor defaults. Through the massive glass walls of the ballroom, we could all see the flashing red and blue lights of heavy tow trucks pulling directly into the crowded valet circle. The flashing lights of the tow trucks reflecting off the glass walls of the crown jewel ballroom were the definitive end of my father's empire. 3 months passed since that night, and the fallout remained absolute and merciless. The local and national media had a feeding frenzy with the story of the great Richard Wilson's spectacular downfall. Without the $600 million acquisition payout, his heavily leveraged firm collapsed within 3 short days. The federal authorities stepped in shortly after. Richard was formally indicted on multiple federal charges of financial fraud and illegal development practices. He was currently under house arrest wearing an ankle monitor, while his expensive defense attorneys desperately tried to keep him out of federal prison. The architectural world moved swiftly to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. Cameron was entirely blacklisted. No firm in the country would even look at his resume after the public revelation of his intellectual property theft. The last I heard, my brother, the former golden child and supposed visionary architect, was working a minimum wage retail job at a hardware store out in the distant suburbs, entirely stripped of his unearned prestige and his massive trust fund. I sat in my spacious corner office at Vanguard Holdings, watching a torrential spring downpour wash over the Chicago skyline. The rain hammered violently against the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows. The crown jewel acquisition had been officially finalized, integrated smoothly into the Vanguard portfolio, and my personal trust was secure. I had finally achieved the total financial and professional independence my grandmother Beatrice had meticulously planned for me. My desk phone chimed with a priority alert from the ground floor security desk. I pressed the flashing button and answered. The head of building security, a massive former police officer named Davis, spoke in a tight, uncomfortable voice. He informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was refusing to leave the main plaza entrance. Davis explained that she was standing completely outside the protective awning in the freezing driving rain. She was reportedly causing a scene, crying hysterically, and aggressively demanding to speak with the senior director of acquisitions. He asked if I wanted him to call the local authorities to have her formally removed for trespassing. I watched the gray rain streak down the glass of my office window, feeling a hollow, heavy silence settle in my chest. I told Davis to hold his position. I told him I would come down to the plaza and handle the situation myself. I took the private executive elevator down to the massive marble lobby. The Vanguard headquarters was a fortress of polished stone and dark steel projecting absolute stability. Through the revolving glass doors, I could see the driving rain pounding against the concrete plaza. Patricia stood right in the middle of the downpour. She looked absolutely nothing like the perfectly manicured, socially dominant woman who used to host extravagant charity galas and sneer at my career choices. Her expensive blonde hair was plastered flat against her skull, dripping muddy water onto the shoulders of a beige trench coat that looked completely ruined. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. The moment she saw me step through the revolving doors and under the wide protective awning, she rushed forward. The Vanguard security guards instantly moved to intercept her, putting their hands up to stop her advance. I raised a single hand, signaling them to let her approach, but to keep her off the dry pavement of the entrance. Patricia stopped just inches from the dry concrete, the rain still violently lashing against her back. She looked up at me, her mascara running in thick black rivers down her pale, aging cheeks. She reached a trembling, waterlogged hand out toward me, her voice cracking as she loudly spoke my name over the roar of the pouring rain. Patricia openly wept, her tears mixing with the freezing rain. She cried that they had absolutely nothing left. She explained frantically that the federal asset freeze had completely drained their personal bank accounts and seized all of their offshore investments. The bank had just delivered a formal notice of foreclosure on the family mansion in Beacon Hill. She begged me to understand that they were going to be thrown out onto the street by the end of the month. She grabbed the edge of her soaked coat, pulling it tighter around her shivering frame. She pleaded for a family loan. She swore that it would only be a temporary measure, just enough capital to cover the mortgage arrears and secure a decent legal defense team for Richard. She used the word family repeatedly, leaning heavily on the very concept she and my father had weaponized against me my entire life. She cried that a daughter could not possibly let her own mother become homeless. She promised that things would be completely different now that they had all learned their lesson, and that they would finally respect my position and my massive wealth. I stood perfectly dry under the wide steel awning, watching her shiver in the relentless storm. I looked into the desperate, pleading eyes of the woman who had watched her husband systematically destroy my confidence for decades and never once raised her voice in my defense. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely blank. I told her that the family she was crying about had never existed. I reminded her that when I needed basic support, she had looked the other way, perfectly content to let Richard steal my future to fund her luxurious lifestyle. I stated clearly that the Beatrice Wilson Trust was not a charity fund for federal criminals. I explicitly denied the loan. Patricia gasped, her jaw dropping open as the finality of my decision crushed her last remaining hope. I turned my back on her weeping figure, walked back through the revolving glass doors, and let the storm wash the past away. As the heavy glass revolved behind me, the deafening roar of the torrential rain was instantly muted, replaced by the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the Vanguard Holdings lobby. The polished marble floor gleamed under the warm ambient lighting, completely untouched by the chaos raging just outside. I stood in the center of the expansive atrium, my breathing steady and deep. Security Chief Davis stepped forward from his post near the front desk. He crossed his massive arms over his chest and looked at me with a quiet, respectful expression, waiting for my final directive. I did not need to speak. I simply met his eyes and gave him a single definitive nod. Davis immediately tapped his earpiece, instructing the exterior guards to physically escort the trespassing woman off the private corporate property. I turned my head just enough to watch the scene unfold through the sprawling glass panels. The security personnel moved with swift professional efficiency. They did not touch Patricia roughly, but their sheer size and coordinated movements offered her absolutely no room to argue or resist. She flailed her arms one last time, her mouth opening in a silent scream of outrage, before she finally surrendered to the inevitable. I watched the guards guide her away from the entrance, forcing her to walk out into the freezing, unsympathetic streets of downtown Chicago. She faded into the gray sheet of the relentless storm, her ruined beige trench coat blending into the bleak urban landscape until she completely disappeared from my view. There were absolutely no apologies accepted. and no lifelines given. That woman had allowed my father to systematically erase my existence for her own comfort, and I was finally returning the favor. The heavy toxic weight I had carried since childhood lifted from my shoulders, leaving behind a sensation of pure, unfiltered clarity. I walked purposefully toward the private executive elevator bank at the rear of the lobby. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone floor, the sound echoing with a powerful, commanding cadence. I pressed the silver call button and stepped into the quiet, mahogany-lined car. I inserted my personalized security key, turning it to authorize the ascent to the highest floor of the building. The doors slid shut, sealing me in a fast, smooth upward trajectory. As the numbers on the digital display rapidly climbed, I allowed myself to fully process the sheer magnitude of the last 90 days. The corporate transition had been a brutal, highly publicized bloodbath, but I had navigated every single legal challenge with absolute precision. Vanguard Holdings had completely absorbed the Crown Jewel complex, stripping away every trace of the Wilson family branding. We had purged the toxic leases, fired the incompetent contractors my father had hired to save money, and restructured the entire debt profile. I had overseen every detail, ensuring the foundation was fundamentally sound. In honor of the woman who had actually made this all possible, Vanguard had officially renamed the flagship skyscraper. I was not just riding to the top floor of a commercial building. I was ascending to the pinnacle of the newly christened Vanguard Beatrice Tower. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the penthouse level. The doors glided open, revealing a sprawling open-concept executive suite that spanned the entire width of the building. This was my domain now. I stepped out of the elevator and walked across the rich, dark hardwood floors of my office. The space was completely stripped of the heavy, oppressive decor my father had always favored. There were no leather armchairs smelling of stale cigars, no ostentatious oil paintings meant to intimidate guests, and absolutely no fabricated awards hanging on the walls. Instead, the room was bright, minimalist, and deeply functional. A massive custom-built drafting table dominated the center of the room, positioned directly beneath a modern brushed steel lighting fixture. I walked over to the table and ran my fingertips gently across the smooth, angled surface. Spread out across the massive workspace was a pristine set of architectural blueprints. I leaned over the table, bracing my hands on the edges, and studied the complex interwoven lines of ink. This was not a stolen design. It was a massive new urban development project I had drafted entirely from scratch. The plans detailed a revolutionary mixed-use commercial pavilion designed to anchor the south side of the city. It utilized sustainable, cutting-edge materials and an innovative tensile support structure that completely redefined modern weight distribution models. It was bold, structurally flawless, and incredibly beautiful. I moved my eyes down to the bottom right corner of the expansive drafting paper. The title block was stamped with crisp, black ink. It did not carry my father's corporate logo. It proudly displayed my own name, Kira Wilson, listed as the sole lead architect and primary structural engineer. Seeing my name etched permanently into the foundation of something so massive sent a profound, stabilizing thrill straight to my core. For years, my father had successfully convinced the entire industry that I possessed absolutely no talent. He had paraded Cameron around as a brilliant prodigy while burying my authentic designs in the shadows of his stolen empire. Now Cameron worked in retail obscurity, Richard faced federal prison time, and I stood at the absolute peak of the Chicago commercial real estate market. The violent spring storm that drenched my mother was beginning to break. The heavy dark clouds over Lake Michigan were fracturing, splitting apart to reveal brilliant rays of late afternoon sunlight. I picked up a silver drafting pencil, making one precise adjustment to the calculation on the blueprint. The math was flawless. The physics were perfectly balanced. I set the pencil down and walked away from the drafting table, moving slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that formed the western wall of my office. I stood close to the glass, looking out over the skyline I was about to redefine, completely free of the shadows of my past. The story of Kira's ultimate triumph over her father's stolen empire is more than just a dramatic corporate takeover. It is a profound lesson in reclaiming your personal power. For years, Kira was subjected to emotional manipulation, constant belittling, and the blatant theft of her own brilliance by the very people who were supposed to protect and nurture her. Her family utilized the concept of loyalty not as a bond of unconditional love, but as a heavy chain of control. They expected her to remain a silent, obedient shadow while they built a glittering, fraudulent legacy on her stolen genius. However, Kira's journey teaches us that true strength does not require immediate loud retaliation. Instead, it requires incredible patience, strategic planning, and an unwavering belief in your own inherent value. She did not waste her precious energy trying to convince her abusers of her worth. She quietly assembled her truth, guarded her resources, and struck only when her victory would be absolute. The most vital takeaway from this saga is that sharing DNA with someone does not grant them a lifelong license to exploit you. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic family members warm. When Patricia stood in the freezing rain begging for a family loan, Kira's refusal was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-respect. Sometimes the only way to break generational cycles of abuse is to firmly close the door and refuse to offer lifelines to the people who deliberately tried to drown you. Kira teaches us that you have the absolute right to evict toxic people from your life and build a towering, beautiful future with your own name proudly on the foundation. Have you ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace and future? How did you find the strength to reclaim your independence? Share your own experiences in the comments below. If Kira's journey to ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of incredible resilience and triumphant comebacks.